A millionaire invited a homeless woman to his ex-fiancée's wedding, but what she did that night left everyone in shock. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and let us know where you're tuning in from. Sit back and enjoy. Alexander Lancaster, a self-assured and affluent businessman, held an elegant wedding invitation between his fingers. The sender? His ex-fiancée. The very woman who had walked away from him without a shred of hesitation, choosing another man over him. And now, as if fate had a cruel sense of humor, she had the audacity to send him an invitation to her wedding. It felt less like an invitation and more like a taunt, a deliberate attempt to flaunt her newfound happiness. "Is this some kind of joke?" he muttered, tossing the envelope onto his polished mahogany desk. His longtime friend, Darian Carter, picked up the invitation and let out a low whistle. "That's cold. So, are you going?" Alexander let out a humorless chuckle. "And show up alone, looking like a man who lost? Not a chance." "Then don't go alone. Take someone. Show her you've moved on." It was a simple suggestion, yet it sparked an idea in Alexander's mind. But bringing just anyone wouldn't do. No, if he was going to do this, he needed to make a statement. Something that would leave Valentina wondering about the man he had become. That evening, as he stepped out of his office and strolled down the bustling street, the thought still lingered in his mind. And then he saw her. A young woman sat on the cold pavement outside a busy restaurant. Her clothes were tattered, her skin smudged with city dust, yet her face was strikingly beautiful. Her unruly hair cascaded over her shoulders. But it wasn't the weariness of her appearance that caught his attention. It was her eyes. They held no trace of desperation, no silent plea for help. Instead, they were fierce, unwavering. On a whim, Alexander approached her, his hands tucked casually into his pockets as he towered over her. "Hey, you need money?" The woman glanced up, but instead of gratitude, her gaze held something sharper. Curiosity, perhaps even mild disdain. She studied him with an intensity that made him feel, for the first time in a long while, like he was the one being evaluated. Then, slowly, a smirk curled on her lips. "What is this, some kind of social experiment? You ask me that question, and depending on my answer, you either toss me a few bills or walk away feeling morally superior?" Alexander raised an eyebrow. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that. "Come with me to an event," he said coolly, "and I'll pay you enough to turn your life around." She let out a short, dry chuckle, shaking her head as if amused by his choice of words. "Enough to change my life?" she echoed. "Wow, do you always speak in dramatic one-liners? Or is this just your way of pretending to be a knight in shining armor?" There was a biting sarcasm in her tone, unexpected and disarming. Still, Alexander kept his composure. "You don't have to do much," he replied. "Just dress up, smile, and accompany me for the night." She tilted her head slightly, amusement flickering in her deep, knowing eyes. "Oh, I get it now," she mused. "You want to be your decorative doll for the evening, don't you?" Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. This woman wasn't just engaging him in conversation, she was challenging him, and something about that made him more intrigued than he cared to admit. "If you're not interested in the offer, I'm sure I can find someone else," Alexander said coolly. She let out a laugh. This time, a genuine, amused one. "Is this a joke? Because honestly, I don't see a line of candidates forming around here," she quipped, crossing her arms. He pressed his lips together, suppressing the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. How the hell was she flipping the situation on him? Then, without warning, she rose to her feet, casually brushing the dust off her dress before stepping forward.
"Too close."
"I'll accept," she announced, her voice laced with something almost playful, as if she were the one doing him a favor. "But only because I'm curious." Alexander narrowed his eyes. There was something dangerous in the way she said that. Something unpredictable. "Curious?" he echoed, his voice measured. "Curious about what?" She tilted her head, a glint of mischief dancing in her gaze. "Suspicious?" she teased, her lips curving into a slow smile. Then, in a softer, more deliberate tone, she added, "I want to see just how far a man like you is willing to go." For a moment, Alexander simply stood there, unmoving. Who the hell was this woman? The engine purred as the sleek luxury car rolled smoothly through the city streets. Inside, Isadora sat comfortably, her gaze fixed on the blurred lights passing by outside. She wasn't fidgeting, wasn't marveling at the opulence around her. No nervous glances, no awestruck silence. Just quiet observation. Alexander, seated beside her, found himself waiting, expecting even for some kind of reaction. A question, a hesitant remark, something to indicate that she was still processing the absurdity of the situation. But there was nothing, just effortless acceptance. "You don't even want to know where we're going?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. She turned to him, her lips quirking in amusement. "Someplace expensive, I imagine." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "And you're not even a little curious?" "Should I be?" she countered smoothly, tilting her head slightly. "You found me on the street and offered me money to be your date. That's already strange enough. But I doubt you're planning to sell me into human trafficking or anything." Alexander let out a low chuckle. "No, nothing quite that sinister. Just a social event. A wedding, right?" His eyes flicked to her. "How do you know that?" She met his gaze, an unreadable expression flickering across her face. "You have that look," she said simply. "A man out for revenge." Alexander's jaw tightened. She was reading him too easily, peeling away layers he hadn't even realized were showing, and he didn't like it. "And if I am?" he asked, his voice measured. She gave a small shrug, entirely unfazed. "Does it matter to me, as long as I get paid?" Alexander smirked. He found himself appreciating her attitude. Unshaken, self-assured. But there was something else, something he couldn't quite place. She accepted everything so easily, as if none of this fazed her, and that made him want to understand her even more. Minutes later, the car came to a smooth stop in front of an opulent building. One of the most prestigious beauty salons in the city. Isadora stepped out without hesitation, moving with a quiet grace that intrigued him. No questions, no hesitation, just complete acceptance. The scent of high-end products filled the air as they entered. The moment Alexander stepped inside, a team of stylists rushed forward, eager to accommodate him. "I want a complete transformation," he said smoothly. "Hair, makeup, wardrobe, the works." The staff nodded professionally, already moving into action. Within seconds, Isadora was ushered into a styling chair. She tilted her head slightly, watching him through the mirror. "If you want to change your mind, now's the time." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Change my mind? About what?" "Me." A hint of amusement flickered in her voice. "I suppose I expected you to want someone more impressionable." He crossed his arms, studying her. "Are you not impressed by any of this?" "Not particularly." She closed her eyes as the hairdresser began working through the tangles in her hair. "I've been in this world before." Alexander frowned at that. Before he could press her for details, one of the stylists gently steered him away. "Mr. Lancaster, would you mind waiting outside and letting us do our work?" He cast one last glance at Isadora before nodding and stepping away. But the intrigue remained. Hours passed at an agonizing pace. Alexander had been glancing at his watch more often than he cared to admit. When a stylist finally approached and called his name, he stood immediately, making his way back into the salon. Then he saw her. For a fleeting second, he forgot to breathe. The woman before him was nothing like the one he had found sitting on the curb earlier that day. Her once disheveled hair now cascaded in sleek, glossy waves over her shoulders. Her skin, once marked with exhaustion, now glowed under the soft lighting, enhanced by expertly applied makeup. Her eyes, sharp, unwavering, were accentuated with just the right touch of elegance. The fitted dress sculpted her figure perfectly, while the high heels elongated her frame, making her seem even more poised, more confident. But none of that was what truly caught his attention. It was her expression. She didn't seem startled. She didn't gape at her reflection like someone seeing themselves in a new light. Instead, she simply observed, studying herself in the mirror with quiet recognition, as if she had seen herself like this before. Alexander took a step closer, unable to shake the curiosity gnawing at him. "What is it?" she asked, meeting his gaze through the mirror. "You don't look surprised," he remarked. A small smile played on Isadora's lips, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Because I'm not." Alexander narrowed his eyes slightly, crossing his arms. "Who are you, Isadora?" She grabbed the purse with effortless grace. The The stylist handed it to her, and without hesitation, she walked toward him. "Someone who knows how to seize good opportunities when they arise," she said smoothly. The car glided down the illuminated boulevard, its sleek frame slicing through the night as it carried them toward the event. An event Alexander had been dreading, but now found himself oddly anticipating. Beside him, Isadora sat in poised silence, her gaze lazily tracing the passing cityscape. Her calmness bordered on infuriating. He had expected some sign of nervousness, perhaps a flicker of unease at stepping into a world so different from the one he had found her in. But since leaving the salon, she had remained entirely composed, as if she had always belonged in this world. "You're very quiet," Alexander remarked, his eyes flicking toward her. "I'm just enjoying the silence," he replied with a faint knowing smile. He frowned slightly. "Most people in your situation would be overwhelmed by all this." She let out a soft chuckle. "Maybe I'm not like most people." Alexander studied her for a moment. There was something about her that eluded him, something he couldn't quite place. He had expected curiosity, maybe even gratitude. Instead, she remained enigmatic, a puzzle he wasn't sure how to solve. But one thing was clear: pressing her for answers wouldn't get him anywhere. The car finally rolled to a stop in front of the grand banquet hall. Outside, the city's elite had already begun to gather, a sea of designer gowns, tailored suits, and glittering jewelry. Couples stepped out of sleek limousines and high-performance sports cars, their every move documented by journalists and photographers eager to capture the spectacle for the society pages. Alexander exited first, adjusting his suit with practiced ease. Then he extended his hand toward Isadora. Without hesitation, she accepted, and the moment she stepped out, the shift in the atmosphere was immediate. All eyes turned toward her. Conversations hushed, women leaned in to whisper to one another, their curious gazes flitting between her and Alexander, trying to decipher who this mysterious woman was. Men watched with interest, their expressions varying from admiration to intrigue. Isadora, however, remained unshaken. With flawless poise, she lifted her chin slightly, her lips curving into a subtle, unreadable smile, one that suggested she was no stranger to attention. She walked beside Alexander as if she had done it 100 times before, as if the flashing cameras and murmuring crowd were nothing more than background noise. Alexander guided her down the red carpet, keeping his posture relaxed yet authoritative. The grandeur of the venue surrounded them. Towering floral arrangements, glistening chandeliers visible through the arched entrance, the low hum of classical music drifting from within. "Follow my lead," he murmured under his breath. "Be polite, smile, and don't draw unnecessary attention." She arched a brow, amusement flickering in her eyes. "Did you bring me here to make your ex jealous or to be invisible?" Alexander pressed his lips together, choosing not to answer. She smirked. "That's what I thought." They stepped through the grand double doors, entering a ballroom bathed in golden light. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above, casting a warm glow over the elegantly dressed guests. Laughter and refined conversation filled the air, mingling with the soft notes of a string quartet playing in the background. And then, across the room, Alexander spotted her. Valentina, standing beside her fiancé, she looked every bit the radiant bride-to-be. But as her eyes swept across the crowd and landed on him, something flickered in her expression. Alexander smirked slightly. "Let the games begin." Valentina looked breathtaking in an exquisitely tailored white gown, every detail meticulously designed to exude grace and perfection. Her smile was effortless, honed over years of practice. Warm enough to charm, yet calculated enough to conceal. Beside her stood Charles Montrose, the textbook definition of a man her family would approve of. Wealthy, conventional, and utterly predictable. As her gaze swept the room, she met Alexander's eyes for a fleeting second. Surprise flickered in her expression, but before she could fully react, her attention shifted to Isadora. And for the first time that evening, Valentina's composed exterior faltered. It was brief, almost imperceptible. But Alexander caught it. That split second of uncertainty, the slight widening of her eyes as she took in the woman standing beside him. With an air of quiet confidence, Alexander led Isadora toward them, his smile perfectly controlled. "Valentina," he greeted, his tone polite but edged with unmistakable coolness. She blinked, as if regaining her composure, before forcing a smile. "Alexander, what a surprise! I didn't expect you to come." "Of course I came," he turned slightly, gesturing toward his companion. "And I brought company." Valentina's eyes flickered over Isadora, scanning her from head to toe. There was no disguising the sharp calculation behind them. "We haven't been introduced," she said smoothly. "You are—" Before Alexander could respond, Isadora extended her hand with effortless grace. "Isadora, a pleasure to meet you." Her voice was composed, elegant, her posture impeccable, and her smile perfectly poised, neither subservient nor boastful, simply unshaken. Valentina hesitated before shaking her hand, and in that moment, Alexander saw it, the faintest trace of discomfort, the subtle flicker of uncertainty. "You look familiar," Valentina remarked, her tone carefully neutral. Isadora's lips curved into an unreadable smile. "Do I?" For a fraction of a second, silence hung between them. Valentina's practiced smile remained, but Alexander could see the tension in her eyes. She was unsettled. Exactly as he had hoped, Carol, sensing the awkward shift in the conversation, cleared his throat and lifted his champagne flute. "Shall we toast?" Alexander nodded, raising his own glass, but before he could say anything, Isadora spoke, her voice carrying just enough weight to draw everyone's attention. "I hope you'll be very happy," she said smoothly, her tone genuinely pleasant. "Marriage is a serious commitment. I was once engaged myself." The impact was immediate. Alexander felt the words like a sudden shift in the air. Valentina's smile stiffened, and Charles shot her a questioning glance. "Really?" Valentina asked, her tone deceptively light. Isadora nodded, taking an unhurried sip of her champagne. "Yes, but it didn't work out." She lowered her glass, meeting Valentina's gaze directly. "My fiancé decided I wasn't the right choice for his family. My fiancé decided I wasn't the right choice for his family." A flicker of something passed over Valentina's face. Something Alexander recognized all too well. And just like that, the balance of power shifted. Valentina looked radiant, draped in an immaculate white gown that clung to her figure in all the right places. Every detail was carefully curated, from the subtle shimmer of her dress to the soft curls framing her face. Her smile, practiced, deliberate, was designed to charm, to captivate. Standing beside her was Charles Montrose, the quintessential choice for a husband. Wealthy, respectable, and utterly predictable. A man who fit neatly into the mold of what her family deemed acceptable. As her gaze swept the room, she locked eyes with Alexander for a brief second. A flicker of surprise passed over her features, but she masked it quickly, and then she saw Isadora. And froze. The change in her expression was subtle, barely perceptible, but Alexander caught it. The way her eyes slightly narrowed, the way her smile faltered just a fraction. He was trying to place Isadora, to make sense of the striking woman standing beside her ex-fiancé. With an air of practiced confidence, Alexander led Isadora forward, his smirk calculated. "Valentina," he greeted, his voice smooth but laced with unmistakable coolness. She blinked rapidly, regaining her composure before forcing a smile. "Alexander, what a surprise! I didn't expect you to come." "Of course I came." He glanced at Isadora. "And I brought company." Valentina's gaze swept over Isadora in a silent assessment, taking in every detail, the perfectly styled hair, the effortlessly elegant posture, the quiet but undeniable presence. "We haven't been introduced," she said with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You are?" Before Alexander could respond, Isadora extended her hand, her movement fluid, confident. "Isadora, a pleasure to meet you." Her voice was poised, refined. There was no hint of uncertainty, no attempt to seek approval. Her presence alone commanded attention. Valentina hesitated before taking her hand, her reluctance masked by another practiced smile. But Alexander saw it, the fleeting discomfort, the barely there hesitation. "You look familiar," Valentina remarked, her tone light but probing. Isadora's lips curved into an enigmatic smile. "Do I?" For a moment, silence stretched between them. Valentina held her gaze, searching for something. Recognition, perhaps? Understanding? But Isadora offered nothing. Charles, sensing the tension that had crept into the conversation, cleared his throat and lifted his champagne flute. "Shall we toast?" Alexander nodded, but before he could turn away, Isadora spoke, her voice carrying just enough weight to hold everyone's attention. "I hope you'll be very happy," she said smoothly. "Marriage is a serious commitment. I was once engaged myself." The words landed like a perfectly timed move in an intricate game. Alexander tensed slightly. Across from him, Valentina and Charles exchanged swift, unreadable glances. "Really?" Valentina asked, her tone light, but the curiosity behind it unmistakable. Isadora nodded, bringing the champagne glass to her lips. She took an unhurried sip before continuing, her expression unreadable. "But it didn't work out," she added, lowering her glass. Then, with quiet precision, she met Valentina's gaze. "My fiancé decided I wasn't the right choice for his family." The subtext was razor-sharp, yet spoken with an air of complete nonchalance. For the first time that evening, Valentina's carefully crafted mask cracked, just slightly, and Alexander knew the game had only just begun. A subtle chill ran down Alexander's spine. The message had been clear, pointed, and Valentina had caught it. His ex-fiancée's expression barely shifted, but Alexander knew her too well. The slight narrowing of her eyes, the nearly imperceptible tightening of her grip on her champagne glass. It was all there. "That's an interesting coincidence," Valentina said, her voice smooth but slightly clipped. Isadora smiled, unfazed. "I think so too." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words. Alexander could practically see the calculations running through Valentina's mind as she struggled to maintain her carefully composed exterior. Then, with the same effortless grace she had wielded all evening, Isadora turned slightly and placed a light hand on Alexander's arm. "Would you like to dance?" He blinked, caught off guard. "Dance?" "Yes," she said, tilting her head. "Or would you rather stay here and watch your ex-fiancée try to figure out where she knows me from?" Alexander chuckled, low and amused. He liked this game she was playing. "Let's dance." Without sparing Valentina another glance, they moved toward the dance floor, leaving her behind. Visibly unsettled, the orchestra's melody swirled around them as Alexander led Isadora into a smooth waltz. Their steps were effortless, perfectly synchronized, as if they had danced together before. His gaze remained locked on hers, searching, questioning. "You did that on purpose," he murmured. Her lips curved into a knowing smile. "Didn't I tell you? I've been in this world before." A mix of irritation and admiration stirred in Alexander's chest. Isadora wasn't just a homeless woman he had plucked from the street. She knew exactly what she was doing. Every glance, every word, it was all intentional. As they moved in perfect rhythm, the golden chandeliers cast a warm glow over the dance floor, the music flowing seamlessly through the grand ballroom. "You keep surprising me," Alexander admitted, his tone quieter now. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Isadora arched an eyebrow. "I haven't decided yet." She let out a soft laugh, her eyes shimmering with amusement. "I think you already know I'm not exactly what I seem. I've realized you know far more about this world than you should." Isadora tilted her head slightly, her gaze never wavering. "Let's just say I've been surrounded by people like this before." Before Alexander could press her further, a group of men approached. Businessmen, investors, magnates he knew well. Their polished smiles and effortless confidence fit seamlessly into the world Isadora had just hinted at. And just like that, the game shifted again. "Lancaster," one of the businessmen greeted, shaking Alexander's hand firmly. "You finally decided to make an appearance at a social event." Alexander returned the handshake with practiced ease. "I thought it would be interesting to celebrate the happy couple." The man chuckled, but his attention quickly shifted to Isadora, his gaze sweeping over her with evident curiosity. "And who is your lovely companion?" Before Alexander could respond, Isadora stepped forward, extending her hand with effortless grace. "Isadora, a pleasure to meet you." She spoke with such natural confidence that none of the businessmen thought to question her presence. "Isadora?" one of them repeated thoughtfully, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Your face looks familiar." Isadora smiled, her expression giving nothing away. "Perhaps we've met at an event before?" The businessman nodded, considering her words, but chose not to press further. Alexander, however, was watching her closely. She was blending in too well, too seamlessly. "And what do you do, Isadora?" another businessman inquired, intrigued. A waiter passed by, and Isadora effortlessly plucked a champagne flute from the tray. She swirled the golden liquid idly, as if contemplating her answer before speaking. "I enjoy observing the financial markets," she said, her tone light yet deliberate. "The surge in technology investments has been fascinating, especially the influx of new startups focused on artificial intelligence." A brief silence followed. Alexander almost laughed at the subtle shift in the businessmen's expressions, mild surprise giving way to genuine interest. "That's a rather specific topic," one of them remarked, clearly intrigued. Isadora took a slow sip of her champagne, her lips curving into a knowing smile. "I simply follow trends," she said, smoothly. "After all, in business everything comes down to who gets the inside information first, doesn't it?" The men exchanged glances before breaking into amused laughter, their initial wariness dissolving into appreciation. She had them. Alexander, however, felt something else entirely. She wasn't just fitting in, she was commanding the space, effortlessly shifting the dynamic in her favor, and that realization both fascinated and frustrated him. Before he could intervene, another figure approached. Tall, imposing, with an aura of quiet authority, Darian Blackwood stepped into the conversation. One of the most influential investors in the country, Blackwood was known for his sharp instincts, his ability to read people with unnerving accuracy. He had built an empire on knowing who to trust and, more importantly, who to manipulate. His keen eyes settled on Isadora with undisguised interest. "Isadora, is it?" Isadora turned to him with a poised smile. "It is." Blackwood studied her for a moment, his gaze assessing. "You seem very comfortable here." Isadora held his stare, completely unfazed. "Maybe because I am." For the first time that evening, Alexander felt something unexpected, an unsettling sense that he was no longer the one in control. Darian chuckled, his deep, resonant laugh carrying an edge of intrigue. "I like that," he mused. Then, with an almost casual air, he asked, "And what exactly is your relationship with Lancaster?" Isadora shot Alexander a playful look, her lips curving into an enigmatic smile before answering. "Just an interesting partnership." Alexander felt his jaw tighten. She was playing a dangerous game. Her game. And he didn't like losing control. "Indeed," he interjected smoothly, masking his irritation. Without breaking eye contact, he plucked the champagne glass from her fingers and handed it off to a passing waiter. "Now, if you'll excuse us, I need to borrow my companion for a moment." Before she could react, he took her wrist, not harshly but firmly enough to make a point, and led her toward a more secluded part of the ballroom, away from prying eyes. Once they were alone, his grip loosened, but the intensity in his gaze remained. "What exactly are you doing?" he asked, his voice low, edged with barely restrained frustration. Isadora smiled. "Unbothered, unshaken, just having fun." "You're standing out too much. Wasn't that the plan?" she countered, tilting her head. "To make your ex-fiancée jealous?" Alexander narrowed his eyes, studying her. "She's enjoying this too much." "You play very well, Isadora. And you don't like it when you can't control the game, do you?" He let out a short laugh, shaking his head slightly. "You're not just a simple beggar." Isadora crossed her arms, one brow arching in amusement. "And it took you this long to figure that out?" Before he could respond, a familiar voice interrupted them. "I hope you're enjoying the party," Valentina said smoothly. Her words were polite, but her gaze was laser-focused on Isadora, assessing her with a quiet but undeniable sharpness. "Very much," Isadora replied, before Alexander could speak, her tone light, almost playful. Valentina's smile remained, but it was carefully measured. "You know, Isadora," she continued, tilting her head slightly. "I feel like we've met before." "Maybe," Isadora answered with an elegant shrug. "The high society world can be quite small, after all." Alexander caught the faint tightening of Valentina's lips, the first crack in her composure. "And where do you know Alexander from?" Valentina pressed, her voice still pleasant but laced with something sharper. Isadora's smile didn't waver. "I think it's more fun if that stays a mystery." Valentina let out a soft laugh, but there was no warmth in it. Of course, mystery always adds an interesting touch to stories. Then, without missing a beat, she turned to Alexander. "Can we talk for a moment?" Alexander hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. But before stepping away, he glanced at Isadora one last time. She simply smiled, that same knowing, unreadable expression on her face, as if she was 3 steps ahead of everyone in the room. Whatever she was doing, she was enjoying every second of it. Alexander followed Valentina out onto a private balcony. The night air was crisp, the city lights stretching endlessly beneath them, but as he turned to face her, the look in her eyes burned hotter than any of the stars above. "Who is she, Alexander?" Valentina asked bluntly, crossing her arms over her pristine dress. Her tone was sharper now, stripped of pretense. Alexander met her gaze without flinching, his expression carefully neutral. "Isadora, my companion." She let out a dry laugh, tilting her head slightly. "Don't insult my intelligence. I know the type of woman you usually bring to events like this, and she doesn't fit the mold." A flicker of irritation coursed through him. "What exactly are you trying to say, Valentina?" She took a step closer, her eyes searching his. Where did she come from? He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough. Valentina's eyes widened slightly before narrowing in realization. "My God," she whispered, as if the pieces had finally fallen into place. "You found this woman on the street, didn't you?" Alexander said nothing, and his silence was confirmation enough. Valentina exhaled a quiet laugh. Disbelieving? Almost amused? "This is unbelievable. You brought a beggar to provoke me?" His jaw tightened. "I brought a confident, intelligent woman who fits in here perfectly." Valentina arched an eyebrow, her voice turning silkier but edged with suspicion. A woman who knows too much for someone who was supposedly living on the street. She studied him, her gaze sharp, unyielding. "She doesn't belong in this world. Or does she?" Alexander didn't like her tone. "Don't play games with me, Valentina," he warned, his voice low. "You lost the right to that a long time ago." She didn't flinch. Instead, she straightened her posture, as if solidifying a decision in her mind. "Maybe I did," she conceded. "But I do have the right to know who I'm dealing with." She let the words hang between them for a moment before stepping back, her expression unreadable. "If I were you, Alexander," she said coolly, "I'd be careful. That woman didn't show up in your life by chance." Then, without another word, she turned and walked back toward the ballroom, leaving him standing there, alone, with his doubts. Isadora felt the weight of their stares as she moved through the guests. It was inevitable. Since her arrival, whispers had followed her like a shadow. Speculation, curiosity, envy. But she moved with an effortless ease, as if she had walked through rooms like this 100 times before. And then, Valentina appeared in front of her. "You dance well," she said smoothly. Isadora smiled, unfazed. "Thank you, so do you." Valentina tilted her head, studying her like a puzzle she was determined to solve. "And you speak well," she added. "You know how to carry yourself at an event like this." Isadora's smile remained intact, her voice steady. "I appreciate the compliment." Valentina's lips curled slightly. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation. Isadora locked the door behind her and leaned against it, her pulse quickening. Valentina was suspicious. Alexander was suspicious. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself before stepping toward the mirror. The reflection staring back at her was a stranger, draped in luxury, her makeup flawless, her presence commanding. For a fleeting moment she wondered, was she pretending to be someone else, or was she finally becoming who she was meant to be? With measured movements, she reached into her bag and retrieved a disposable phone. Quickly, she typed a short message. He started investigating. The reply came almost instantly. "Then it's time for you to decide your next move." She stared at the screen for a moment before deleting the message, erasing any trace of the conversation. Letting out a quiet sigh, she leaned against the dresser, her fingers gripping the edges. She couldn't keep this secret forever. Soon, Alexander would find out the truth. Alexander was not a patient man. He thrived on control, on certainty. He dealt in absolutes, black and white, right and wrong, power and submission. But Isadora? She was a contradiction, a puzzle that refused to be solved. and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. As he sipped his morning coffee in his office, his mind remained tangled in the events of the night before. She knew things she shouldn't know. She carried herself like someone bred for high society, yet she had no records, no traceable history. It was as if she had erased her own past. That was unacceptable. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in a long time. The line clicked and a voice greeted him with amusement. "It's been a while, Lancaster." Alexander didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I need you to look into someone." "Straight to business?" the man chuckled. "Who's the target?" "Isadora." A brief pause. "No last name." "That makes things more interesting. I want everything," Alexander said coolly. "Where she came from, who she really is, and why she's hiding something. Give me 48 hours. "Consider it done." Alexander hung up and leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against the desk. Isadora was playing a game. He'd make sure he saw her cards first. Hours later, after leaving the office, he drove to the hotel. He didn't second-guess his decision. He needed answers. Walking into the grand lobby, he made his way straight to the elevator, his movements controlled, deliberate. Once he reached her floor, he knocked on the door. Isadora passed, then finally the door cracked open. Isadora stood there, dressed simply. No extravagant gown, no flawless makeup, and yet, even stripped of all the glamour, she held herself with the same unwavering composure. Alexander met her gaze. Neither of them spoke, but they both knew. The game had shifted. "Were you expecting someone?" Alexander asked, crossing his arms as he studied her. Isadora didn't flinch. She remained calm, almost too calm. "Not really," she replied smoothly. "But you don't seem like the type who announces his arrival, do you?" A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "You're not wrong." She met his gaze steadily, then stepped aside, silently inviting him in. Alexander walked into the room, his sharp eyes scanning the space. Everything was immaculate, too well kept, too carefully arranged. If he hadn't known better, he would have assumed she had always lived this way. There was no sign of someone who had supposedly been on the streets. "Have you always been this straightforward?" he asked, turning back to her. She leaned against the edge of the table, arms crossed. "You don't like small talk, so why should I waste time with it?" He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head slightly before settling onto the couch. "Fair enough," he admitted. Then, his expression darkened. "I want the truth, Isadora." She arched a brow. "The truth about what?" "About you, who you really are." Instead of answering, she tilted her head slightly, observing him. Then, she leaned forward, her voice lower. "Calculated. Why does that bother you so much, Alexander?" His fingers curled slightly, his patience wearing thin. "Because you came out of nowhere, accepted my offer without hesitation, and act like you already belong in this world," he said evenly. "But there are no records of you, anywhere." Silence stretched between them. For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable passed through her eyes. "And what if I don't want to tell you?" she asked finally. Alexander let out a humorless laugh, his gaze hard. "Then I'll find out on my own." A slow, knowing smile crossed her lips. She held his stare for a long moment before sighing. "Fine, Alexander," she said. "I'll tell you a little." He leaned back slightly, waiting. "I grew up in a world very similar to yours," she began. "Luxury, lavish parties, powerful connections. But that world, it can be cruel." She paused, her fingers grazing the rim of a forgotten glass on the table. "Especially when you become an obstacle to the wrong people." Alexander's eyes sharpened. "Obstacle? My family was influential. My father controlled businesses worth more than you can imagine. But one betrayal changed everything. In a single night, it all collapsed." His frown deepened. "Who betrayed you?" She looked away, her expression carefully composed. But he saw it, the flicker of something she was trying to suppress. Alexander didn't miss the way she chose her words. She wasn't saying everything. "And why did you erase your life?" She exhaled softly, her lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because sometimes," she murmured, "it's safer to disappear." The silence between them grew dense, charged with unspoken truths. Alexander studied her carefully. She wasn't telling him everything, but this This was the first real piece of the puzzle. "And now?" he asked, his voice measured. "What do you plan to do?" Isadora crossed her legs gracefully, her expression unreadable. "I'm still deciding." That was all she gave him. Alexander exhaled sharply and stood up, his presence looming over her. "You can keep deceiving me, Isadora," he said, his voice dangerously low, "but I will find out the truth." She didn't flinch, didn't try to stop him. She simply watched as he turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind more questions than answers. The next day, Alexander's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He answered immediately. "I found something," his investigator said. Alexander straightened in his chair, his grip tightening around the phone. "Tell me." "You were right. Isadora isn't who she pretends to be." A slow, cold tension settled in his chest. "Go on," he commanded. "Her real name is Isadora Deo, daughter of Ronan Deo." Alexander's entire body went still. The name sent a chill down his spine. He knew that name. The construction tycoon? "That's the one," the investigator confirmed. "But here's where it gets interesting. Ronan Deo went bankrupt a few years ago. Massive scandal, embezzlement, fraud, and guess who was involved in that mess?" Alexander felt his breath quicken. "Valentina Harrington," he muttered. "Exactly." Alexander fell silent, staring at the documents on his desk but seeing nothing. So Isadora didn't show up by chance," he murmured, half to himself. "Seems like she didn't," the investigator confirmed. Alexander didn't respond. He simply ended the call and placed his phone on the desk, his mind racing. Isadora had a direct connection to Valentina, and that changed everything. Later that evening, he sat in his office, surrounded by files and contracts, but his eyes skimmed over the words without absorbing a single one. His mind was somewhere else. On her. The sparks of anger and vulnerability in her eyes, the way she never backed down, the way she maneuvered through high society like she had been born into it, because she had, and now he knew why. Before he could stop himself, he grabbed his car keys. Minutes later, he was on the road, the city lights flashing past in a blur. There was only one thing he knew for certain. He needed to see her. And this time, he wouldn't leave without the truth. The door creaked open after a few seconds, revealing Isadora. He looked tired, her hair slightly tousled, her expression unreadable, but when she saw him standing there, something flickered in her eyes. Her voice carried a note of surprise. "We need to talk." She exhaled softly, hesitating for only a second before pulling the door open wider, allowing him inside. "I didn't know you made late-night visits," she murmured as she shut the door behind him. "Neither did I." His voice was controlled, but his stance, arms crossed, gaze sharp, spoke of the storm brewing beneath the surface. "Can you stop testing me for a minute and tell me the truth?" "About what?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. His frown deepened. "About why you accepted my proposal without hesitation." For the first time, she looked away. A pause hung between them before she finally spoke. "Because Valentina Harrington destroyed my family." The words sent a cold wave through him. He had already known the truth. But hearing her say it, confirming it, made it feel more real. "Valentina was responsible for my father's downfall," she continued, her voice steady but laced with pain. "For the destruction of my life." Alexander studied her closely. "Tell me everything." Isadora turned toward the window, wrapping her arms around herself. The city lights reflected in her eyes, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Trapped in memories she had tried to bury. "My father, Ronan Deo, owned one of the largest construction companies in the country. He was an honorable, respected man. Until he trusted the Harringtons." She swallowed, her voice tightening. Valentina came into the business as a strategic partner, someone he believed he could rely on. But in reality, she was manipulating him the whole time. "Manipulating how?" Alexander pressed, his voice low. "By creating fraudulent deals, embezzling money, putting his name on illegal transactions without his knowledge." Isadora's breath hitched slightly. "When everything collapsed, my father was the one blamed for corruption. He lost everything, our home, our dignity." Her voice wavered. "He died before he could even defend himself." Something sharp twisted in Alexander's chest. He had seen countless scandals in the business world, but this was personal. "My God," he murmured. Isadora's grip on herself tightened as she continued, her gaze never leaving the city skyline. After that, everything crumbled. My mother got sick soon after. She couldn't hold on, her voice barely above a whisper. I tried to fight. I tried to prove his innocence. But Valentina had already closed every door. Within months, I had nothing left. Alexander exhaled slowly, absorbing the weight of her words. Then, stepping closer, he asked, "You survived on the streets?" A bitter smile ghosted across her lips. Yes, and that's how I learned never to trust anyone again. For a moment, silence filled the space between them, heavy, unspoken things lingering in the air. Then, without thinking, Alexander reached out and gently lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. Her breath caught. For the first time, she saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Understanding, a flicker of something deeper than curiosity. But trust? That was another story. She pulled her face away, her expression guarded. "I don't need a savior, Alexander." He took a slow, measured breath, resisting the instinct to argue. "I know," he admitted, "but that doesn't mean you have to carry everything alone." Isadora let out a soft laugh, but there was no warmth in it. "You think you can protect me?" He didn't hesitate. "I think I want to protect you." Her eyes widened slightly, caught off guard. "And why is that?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Because I don't know what I'm feeling anymore when I'm around you." A charged silence stretched between them. Finally, Azira turned to face him fully. Her gaze was steady, searching. "What does that mean?" "It means you make me uneasy," he admitted. "I've never felt this way before. I can't explain it." She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "And does that bother you?" "More than it should," he muttered. He looked away, as if trying to distance herself from the weight of his words. "Then maybe it's best if we keep our distance." He shook his head. "I can't do that." Her jaw tensed. "This doesn't change anything, Alexander." "I know." She clenched her fists, her voice lowering. "And what about Valentina?" The mention of his ex-fiancée snapped him back to reality. "If everything you said is true, then I don't know who she really is," he admitted. Isadora nodded slowly, her expression darkening. "But I do, and I won't stop until I settle the score." Alexander remained silent. He knew there was no convincing her to walk away from this. "Then I'll be by your side," he said firmly. A flicker of something passed through her eyes. Doubt, disbelief, maybe something else? He gave a small, bittersweet smile. "Even knowing this could end very badly?" He took a step forward, closing the space between them, his voice steady. "Even then." Later that night, Alexander was jolted awake by the sharp ringing of his phone. He reached for it, his instincts already on high alert. "Lancaster, we have a problem," the investigator said, his voice clipped. Alexander sat up, his muscles tensing. "What is it?" "It's Valentina. She already knows Isadora is around." A cold weight settled in his chest. "And she's not happy about it," the investigator added. Alexander swung his legs over the edge of the bed, rubbing his temple. "What is she planning to do?" "We don't know yet," came the grim reply. "But someone is digging for information on Isadora." Alexander's grip tightened around the phone. The game had just changed. And this time, it wasn't just about revenge. It was about survival. Alexander clenched his jaw. Valentina wouldn't back down. "Keep me posted on any updates," he ordered before hanging up. A heavy weight settled in his chest. He knew Valentina, knew the lengths she would go to in order to eliminate threats. And now, Isadora was directly in her sights. He needed to act before it was too late. The next morning, Alexander found Isadora on the hotel balcony. She was sitting on the ground, arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the horizon. The early morning light cast a soft glow over her, but there was an exhaustion in her posture, something fragile beneath the surface. He approached slowly, lowering himself to a crouch beside her. "You know she's found out, right?" Isadora didn't move, her voice quiet but firm. "I know." He exhaled. "She's not going to stop. Neither will I." Alexander studied her. The way her hair was slightly tousled from the wind, the faint darkness under her eyes. She had been fighting for too long, alone. "Isadora?" She blinked rapidly, as if trying to hold something back, but then a single tear slipped down the corner of her eye, and without thinking, Alexander pulled her into an embrace. She stiffened for only a second before exhaling shakily, resting her face against his chest. "It's going to be okay," he murmured against her hair. She didn't respond, didn't resist. She simply let herself be held. For the first time, neither of them spoke. There was no need. Because in that moment, without saying it aloud, they both understood something undeniable. They were in this together. And Valentina had no idea what was coming. Alexander felt it. Something was about to happen. Since his conversation with Isadora the night before, his mind had been restless. The revelation that Valentina had played a role in the downfall of Isadora's family had changed everything. He wanted revenge, not just for Isadora, but for himself. He had almost married a woman capable of destroying lives without hesitation. Now, he needed to find out just how far Valentina was willing to go to protect her secrets. That morning, while reviewing reports in his office, his phone rang. His private investigator. "Alexander, we have a problem." Alexander's grip tightened around his pen. "Go on." "Valentina is up to something," the investigator said. "My contacts say she's digging for information on Isadora. Hard. It looks like she's planning to expose something against her." A slow, dangerous heat burned in Alexander's chest. He gritted his teeth. "What exactly did she find out?" "I don't know yet," the investigator admitted. "But I do know she's already reached out to lawyers and journalists. If she's going that far, it means she has something big." Alexander cursed under his breath and threw the pen on his desk, pushing himself to his feet. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "Find out what it is before she makes a move. I'm on it," the investigator assured him. "But I suggest you warn Isadora." Alexander inhaled sharply, already reaching for his keys. "I'm on my way to her now." When he arrived at the hotel, Alexander didn't bother with pleasantries. He knocked hard on Isadora's door, his patience stretched thin. The door swung open within seconds. She took one look at him, his rigid posture, the sharpness in his gaze, and frowned. "What is it?" Without a word, he stepped inside, shutting the door firmly behind him. "Valentina is making a move against you." Her expression darkened, but she didn't look shocked. "What do you mean?" "She's gathering information and planning something big. My investigator believes she's trying to expose you publicly." Isadora sighed and crossed her arms. "I knew this would happen." Alexander narrowed his eyes. "And you're this calm about it?" She let out a short, humorless laugh. "After everything I've been through, Alexander, do you really think a scandal is going to scare me?" He studied her for a moment, her unwavering posture, the cool defiance in her eyes. He admired her strength, but that didn't change the fact that she was in real danger. "I can protect you," he said. She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "I told you, I don't need a savior." "This isn't about saving you," he countered. "It's about stopping Valentina." Isadora stepped closer, her gaze locking onto his. "And what are you going to do, Alexander?" He reached up, his fingers gently cradling her face. His thumbs brushed over her skin, soft and deliberate. "Whatever it takes." For a moment, neither of them moved. Her eyes flickered. Something passed through them, something Alexander wanted to understand. But just as quickly as it appeared, she buried it, retreating behind her usual mask. "I don't want you to get hurt because of me," she murmured. He gave a faint smile, tilting his head slightly. "Too late for that." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. The moment she looked at the screen, her entire expression changed. Tension tightened across her shoulders, her fingers gripping the device a little too hard. Alexander immediately caught on. "What is it?" he asked, his voice sharp. Isadora hesitated for a fraction of a second before meeting his gaze. And that was all it took for him to know. Whatever had just happened, everything was about to change. He turned the phone toward him. The message was short, but its meaning was clear. "Be careful who you trust. The past always comes back to haunt you." Alexander took the phone from her hands, his jaw tightening. That was Valentina. Isadora exhaled sharply, then took the phone back and deleted the message without hesitation. "She's trying to intimidate me." He shook his head. "No, That means we're getting close to something. She nodded slowly, a fire igniting in her eyes. Then we need to act before she does. But the next morning, Valentina struck first. A scandal broke. Every major newspaper splashed their front pages with headlines that tore into Isadora's past. Isadora Deo, from luxury to the streets. The heiress who lost everything. Former fiancé of Alexander Lancaster involved in corruption scandals. The media was ruthless. Every detail of the Deo family's downfall was dissected, twisted, turned against her. They painted her as an opportunist, a woman desperate to claw her way back into high society. It was a calculated attack, and it had Valentina's fingerprints all over it. At the office, Alexander sat at his desk, skimming through every article, his fury simmering beneath the surface. When the door opened, he didn't need to look up to know who it was. Isadora walked in, her expression unreadable. Without a word, she tossed a magazine onto his desk. "She's trying to destroy me again." Alexander clenched his fists. "That's not going to happen." She let out a soft, humorless laugh. "You always have that absurd confidence." His gaze darkened as he stepped forward, gently tilting her chin up so she had no choice but to look at him. "Because I never lose." For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, something close to hope, but just as quickly, determination took over. "Then let's make sure she loses this time." Alexander nodded, his grip tightening slightly. "It's time to bring Valentina Harrington down." They held each other's gaze, unspoken understanding passing between them. Either of them knew how this would end. The scandal had dominated headlines for days. Valentina had played dirty, twisting Isadora's past into a web of deceit, branding her as a woman who had no place in their world. But Isadora didn't waver. She had waited years for this moment. She wouldn't fall now. And Alexander knew it too. But he also knew one more thing: Valentina wasn't finished. She would make one final move, and this time they had to be ready. That evening, Isadora received an unexpected invitation. A pristine white envelope embossed with gold lettering. "Private dinner at the Harrington Club. Select members only. Your presence is requested." She gripped the invitation tightly, her pulse steady. Seated on the couch in her hotel room, Alexander read the note over her shoulder and scoffed. "This is obviously a trap." "I know." He stood up, running a hand through his hair. "Then you're not going." Isadora turned, her expression defiant. "Of course I'm going." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Isadora, this is my moment, Alexander. I'm not running." His fists clenched at his sides, but he exhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm. "Then let's make sure Valentina is the only one who loses tonight." The Harrington mansion was a spectacle of power and prestige that night. The grand estate was illuminated, its towering chandeliers casting golden light over an elite gathering of guests. Expensive conversations floated through the air, whispers of business deals and power plays unfolding between glasses of aged champagne. And then she walked in. Isadora. She moved through the entrance like she owned the place, her elegant black dress hugging her frame, exuding power and mystery in equal measure. She had come alone, but Alexander was already there, blending into the crowd, watching, waiting, ready. Then came Valentina. Draped in a deep crimson gown, she carried herself with an air of effortless authority. But the moment she saw Isadora, her perfectly poised smile turned sharp. "Isadora," she greeted, her voice sweet but laced with venom. "I'm so glad you accepted my invitation." Isadora took a champagne flute from a passing waiter, twirling the stem between her fingers. "You didn't give me much of a choice." Valentina tilted her head, amusement flickering in her eyes. "I hope you've enjoyed the attention lately. The media loved your story." Isadora smiled, unfazed. "I've gotten used to being the center of attention. Something you've always wanted, haven't you?" For a fraction of a second, something dark flashed in Valentina's eyes, but she quickly masked it with a practiced smirk. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You've lost, Isadora. No matter what you try, you'll never be someone again." Isadora took a slow sip of champagne before setting the glass down with deliberate elegance. "You're wrong." Valentina's smile faltered. "What do you mean?" Before Isadora could answer, a shadow appeared beside her. Alexander, his presence alone made the air shift, commanding, dangerous. Valentina stiffened. "Dear Valentina," he said smoothly, his voice laced with quiet amusement. "It looks like you didn't read the papers today." He handed her an envelope. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers tightening around the edges as she unfolded the contents. The moment her eyes scanned the first few lines, her complexion paled, and it was a complete dossier. Documents, recordings, signatures. Undeniable proof of her involvement in the fraudulent scheme that had ruined the Deo family. Her breath hitched. For the first time that night, Valentina had nothing to say. "This is fake," Valentina whispered, her hands trembling as she gripped the damning documents. Isadora's smile was razor-sharp. "No, it's not. And tomorrow morning, it'll be on every front page." Valentina's entire body tensed, her mask of arrogance cracking. "You can't do this to me," she hissed. Alexander, standing beside Isadora, gave a cold, measured smile. "Just like you did to her." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Everyone was watching. The power she had once commanded with effortless charm was slipping away, evaporating in the face of cold, hard evidence. Her world, her empire, was crumbling. "This can't be happening," she murmured, her voice barely audible, her mind racing for a way out. Isadora leaned in, her voice dangerously soft. "Now you know what it feels like to lose everything." Valentina's eyes darted around the room. Faces she once controlled now bore only expressions of intrigue, judgment, and silent amusement. No one would come to her rescue. Then, before she could even attempt to salvage her dignity, the ballroom doors swung open. A hush fell over the room as two uniformed police officers strode in, followed closely by a prosecutor in a crisp suit. "Ms. Valentina Harrington?" one of the officers announced. Her breath hitched. "Yes." The officer's next words sent a death knell through the room. "You are under arrest for financial fraud, embezzlement, and market manipulation." A collective gasp swept through the guests. Valentina let out a nervous, brittle laugh. "This is ridiculous. I am Valentina Harrington." The prosecutor stepped forward, his tone utterly devoid of sympathy. "And now, you're also a criminal." Isadora crossed her arms, her expression cold. "You thought you were untouchable. You were wrong." The officer stepped forward, securing handcuffs around Valentina's trembling wrists. She screamed, her voice laced with desperation. "Say something." He stared at her, unimpressed. "Your only mistake was thinking you'd never get caught." Valentina's face contorted with rage, her eyes burning with a hatred so raw it was almost pitiful. "This isn't over," she spat. Isadora didn't flinch. "For you, it is." And just like that, in front of the elite she had once ruled over, Valentina Harrington was dragged away. The silence that followed was deafening. Isadora let out a slow, measured breath. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. The next morning, headlines exploded with Valentina's arrest. Harrington empire crumbles overnight. From power to prison, Valentina Harrington's downfall. Deo family vindicated after years of injustice. Within hours, her financial empire collapsed. Investors pulled out. Allies abandoned her. Friends who had once praised her name now pretended they had never met her. By the end of the day, Valentina Harrington was nothing more than a disgraced headline later that evening. Isadora and Alexander stood in his penthouse, overlooking the glittering city below. A bottle of wine sat between them, two untouched glasses beside it. Isadora held hers, absently tracing the rim with her fingertip, lost in thought. The war was over, but what came next? Alexander studied her quietly, sensing the question in her eyes, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if either of them knew the answer. "You did it," Alexander said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. Isadora turned to him, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "We did it." Something in his chest tightened at her words. Something unfamiliar, something unsettling. "And now?" he asked. She sighed, her gaze drifting toward the skyline. "I start over." The tightness in his chest deepened. "I want to help you." She looked at him, skeptical. "How?" Without a word, he walked over to his desk, took an envelope, and handed it to her. She frowned as she took it. "What is this?" "A proposal," he said simply, "for a new business, a company in your name." She blinked, flipping through the pages. "What?" "I want to start something for you, a business of your own, something that belongs to you." Slowly, she set her wine glass down, crossing her arms. "Alexander, I don't need your charity." He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "This isn't charity, Isadora. It's a partnership. You have talent. You have vision. I want you to have something that's yours. Truly yours." She hesitated, her fingers brushing over the envelope. "I don't know." He stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "Isadora, you've spent years fighting. It's time to start building something real." She stared at him, searching for any hint of pity in his expression. But there was none. Only conviction. Finally, she let out a quiet sigh. "All right. But on one condition." His lips curled slightly. "What condition?" She stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. "I do this my way." Alexander's smile deepened. "You always do." The air between them shifted, something warm, something unspoken, lingering in the space between their words. She looked away, but before she could move, he reached out, gently cupping her face. "Isadora?" This time she didn't resist. When he pulled her into a kiss, it wasn't just tension, it was something more, something that had been simmering between them since the moment they met. It was unspoken promises, it was battles fought and won. It was something real. Alexander held her tightly, as if afraid she might slip away. And when she finally pulled back, her gaze met his, steady and unreadable. "Good night, Alexander," she murmured. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Alexander remained still, watching her disappear down the hall. He knew. She felt it too. Days later, Deo Consulting was born. A strategic investment and analysis firm, built from the ground up with precision and resilience. Isadora threw herself into it, rebuilding what had been stolen from her. She handpicked her team, reconnected with old contacts, and slowly, methodically, began reclaiming her place in the business world. And through it all, Alexander was there, never imposing, never overstepping, but always present. Until one night, when he realized he couldn't hold it in any longer. "I'm in love with you," he said without hesitation. Isadora froze. She blinked, caught completely off guard. "Alexander." He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "I knew it early on, but I can't pretend anymore." Her heart pounded. She looked away, forcing herself to take a steady breath. "I can't," she whispered. A flicker of something crossed his face. "What do you mean?" She exhaled, gathering her thoughts. "I'm not ready for a relationship. I just got my life back and I need to focus on that." Alexander studied her for a long moment, before finally nodding. It hurt more than he wanted to admit, but he understood. "All right." A small, bittersweet smile curved on her lips. "You always understand." "But," he said, his voice softer now, "I'm not a man who gives up easily." In the weeks that followed, Alexander made sure she knew he wasn't giving up. Every morning, he left a fresh cup of coffee on her desk. "To keep you going," he'd say with a smirk before walking off. Then came the dinners. "Is this a date?" she asked one evening over an elegantly set table. "Just dinner between business partners," he replied casually, though the glint in his eyes told a different story. And then, the small surprise. A night after a grueling day, Isadora returned to her office to find a bouquet of white lilies on her desk. A simple note rested beside it. "I know you like coffee more than flowers, but I hope you'll enjoy these anyway." She chuckled, shaking her head, but she felt something stir inside her. It wasn't just the persistence. It was the way Alexander supported her, not to win her over, but because he believed in her. And when an investor tried to deceive her, Alexander was the first to warn her. Because this wasn't just about romance. This was about trust. And that, more than anything, was what terrified her the most. When the media tried to twist her story, Alexander made sure the truth was told. He used his influence to silence false narratives, ensuring that no one could rewrite what Isadora had fought so hard to reclaim. And when she had a rough day, when exhaustion weighed heavy in her eyes, he always showed up. With a bottle of wine in one hand and a concerned look in the other. "Want to talk about it?" She hesitated at first, but then, for the first time, she let herself open up. Months passed. Dio Consulting thrived. With every new deal, every strategic victory, Isadora felt her grip on her life solidify. She was no longer the woman clawing her way back. She was the woman in control. But there was one thing she couldn't deny. Alexander was always There told herself it was nothing. At the way her heart raced whenever he smiled at her was nothing. At the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her was nothing. But she knew better. One evening, Isadora attended an exclusive business event, one that gathered the biggest names in the market. She moved through the opulent ballroom with quiet confidence, her navy new dress a perfect balance of sophistication and understatement. She exchanged handshakes, navigated conversations with ease, and secured key introductions, all with the poise of someone who had faced the worst and survived. But she wasn't alone. She felt it before she saw it. Someone watching her. Nico Bisset, a renowned French investor, charismatic, sharp, dangerous in all the ways that mattered in business. He approached with an effortless smile, dark hair slightly tousled, intense eyes brimming with intrigue. "Miss Dio," he greeted smoothly. "At last, I have the pleasure of meeting you in person." Isadora returned a polite smile. "Mr. Bisset, the pleasure is mine." He extended his hand, but instead of a firm handshake, he leaned in, brushing his lips against the back of her hand in a traditional yet undeniably captivating gesture. "I would say the pleasure is all mine." A calculated move. Isadora was used to such advances, but she remained composed. "I assume you're here for business, Mr. Bisset?" He tilted his head slightly, his smile unwavering. "Business can wait for a moment, don't you think?" Then, extending a hand, he asked, "May I have this dance?" She hesitated briefly, then accepted. Dancing meant nothing. Nico guided her onto the dance floor, his grip firm yet respectful as he led her through the steps. His movements were effortless. Too effortless. A skilled dancer. "You dance well, Ms. Dio." Isadora arched an eyebrow, keeping pace with him. "I've learned that a strong presence is essential in business." But as they moved in rhythm, something else caught her attention. Someone else. A presence more intense, more familiar than any whispered flattery or charming smirk. Her gaze flickered toward the edge of the room. Alexander, standing there, watching, and his expression, it was unreadable. But she knew him too well. He wasn't just watching, he was waiting. And suddenly the dance felt a little less meaningless. And outside of business, Nico's voice dipped into something smoother, something more intentional. He leaned in slightly, his gaze locked on hers. "Aren't there moments when you just let yourself enjoy life?" Isadora let out a soft, knowing laugh. "Are you always this persistent?" He smirked. "Only when I find something that genuinely interests me." The music ended, but Nico didn't immediately release her hand. Instead, he led her toward the bar, effortlessly plucking 2 glasses of champagne from a passing waiter and handing one to her. "So tell me," he said, tilting his head, "does a powerful woman like you ever make time for fun?" Before she could answer, she felt it, a shift in the air. A gaze, sharp, penetrating, unmistakable. Slowly she turned. Across the room, Alexander Lancaster stood watching. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, dark, intense, burning with something unspoken, gave him away instantly. Jealousy. He crossed the room with purposeful strides, ignoring the greetings that came his way, his attention locked solely on her. The moment he reached them, he stopped beside her, his irritation barely masked beneath forced composure. "Isadora," his voice was firm, edged with tension. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Nico raised an eyebrow, clearly entertained by the sudden shift in atmosphere. With a polite but knowing smile, he extended a hand. "Mr. Lancaster, correct? I've heard a lot about you." Alexander didn't take it. "And I've heard about you," he replied coolly. The temperature between them seemed to drop several degrees. Isadora exhaled slowly, keeping her posture poised. "Alexander, we were in the middle of a conversation." "Yes, I noticed," he said, his tone razor-sharp as he flicked his gaze toward Nico. And as much as I'd love to keep watching this unfold, I have more important matters to discuss with Isadora. Nico's smirk deepened slightly, but he didn't push. It seems your friend doesn't like sharing attention, he murmured to her, amusement lacing his words. Before Isadora could respond, Alexander stepped forward, his presence alone enough to shift the dynamic entirely. You've had your dance, Bissett. Now, if you don't mind? Isadora huffed in frustration, grabbing Alexander's arm before things escalated. Excuse me, Mr. Bissett, she said smoothly, maintaining her composure. I'll be back in a moment. Without waiting for a response, she pulled Alexander away, her steps firm as they wove through the crowd. She didn't stop until they reached a secluded hallway, away from the music, the whispers, the watching eyes. Then she turned on him, furious. What was that, Alexander? He ran a hand through his hair, his own frustration barely contained. I couldn't stand seeing that guy hitting on you, and that gives you the right to act like a complete idiot? Alexander's jaw tightened. Did you really not notice the way he was looking at you? That wasn't about business, Isadora. And if it wasn't? Her voice was sharp. It's my business, not yours. A tense silence stretched between them. His frustration was evident in the way his hands clenched at his sides, his eyes glinting with something raw, something he wasn't used to feeling. You're right, he finally admitted, his voice low. But I hate the idea of seeing you with another man. Isadora inhaled sharply, trying to push down the wave of emotions threatening to consume her. I'm not yours, Alexander. You have no right to be jealous. She turned on her heel, ready to leave this argument behind, but he followed her. By the time she reached the parking lot, his voice cut through the night. Isadora, wait. She spun around abruptly, fire flashing in her eyes. What more do you want? I want you to listen to me. She let out a bitter laugh. I've heard enough. You need to understand that you can't control me. The air between them was charged, thick with unspoken words. Alexander stared at her, his frustration mirroring her own. And then, suddenly, he grabbed her, his hands firm but not forceful, and crashed his lips onto hers. It was a desperate kiss, rough, demanding, laced with frustration and something deeper neither of them wanted to name. For a split second, Isadora froze. Then, against all logic, she kissed him back. It was electric, intoxicating, a collision of emotions that had been simmering for far too long. But then, reality hit her. She abruptly shoved him away, her breathing uneven. You can't do that. Alexander stood there, chest rising and falling, his eyes dark with something dangerous. I know you felt it. Her hands trembled as she clenched them into fists. That doesn't justify anything. Without another word, she turned and got into her car. Before he could stop her, before he could say anything that might make her stay, she sped out of the parking lot, leaving him standing there, watching her disappear into the night. The next day, Isadora sat in her office, her fingers gripping a pen, but her focus was non-existent. The memory of the kiss haunted her. She had tried so hard, to push it away, to act like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. She barely heard the door open until a familiar voice pulled her back to reality. You can't just show up unannounced, she said, keeping her eyes on her desk. I came to apologize. At that, she finally looked up. Her eyes locked onto his, searching. For the jealousy? She asked, voice steady. Or for the kiss you stole? He sighed. Both. Isadora didn't react. Instead, she simply turned back to her documents. Good. Now, if you don't mind, I have work to do. Alexander held her gaze for a moment longer, as if waiting for something. Anything. That might soften her resolve. But when she didn't budge, he nodded once and walked away. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to focus on her work. It was better this way. That night, the office was nearly empty when Isadora finally packed up her things. Stepping into the cool night air, she made her way toward her car. But as she reached it, something made her stop cold. The faint glint of a scratch on the window. She stepped closer, and her stomach dropped. A word had been crudely etched into the glass. Beware. Her breath came out shaky. Someone was trying to scare her. Her first instinct was to call Alexander, but she hesitated. She didn't want to give him another reason to act like her protector. But before she could decide, her phone buzzed. A new message. Alone, you won't get anywhere. Know when to quit. Her fingers tightened around the device. This time, she didn't hesitate. She dialed Alexander. He picked up on the second ring. What happened? Her voice was steady, but the weight of the situation pressed against her. Someone scratched my car, and I just got a threat. Silence. Then, his voice, calm but firm. I'm on my way. 15 minutes later, Alexander's car pulled up beside hers. He stepped out, his sharp gaze immediately locking onto the scratches on the window. His expression darkened as he studied the damage. Are you okay? He asked, his voice lower now. Yes, she said, arms crossed over her chest. He turned to face her fully. You know you can't ignore this, right? I know. Without another word, Alexander pulled out his phone. His tone was clipped, controlled, when he spoke into it. I need footage from the cameras in this area. Find out who did this. Now. Isadora watched as he took control of the situation with effortless precision. The way he moved, the way he handled threats like this was second nature. She hated relying on anyone. But in that moment, as the weight of the message settled over her, she felt an odd sense of relief that he was there. When Alexander hung up, he turned to her, his expression unreadable. Until we find out who's behind this, I want you to have extra security. Isadora opened her mouth to protest, but he held up a hand. Not negotiable. She huffed but didn't argue. The truth was, as much as she hated the idea of relying on anyone, she knew this wasn't something she could ignore. The following days were filled with tension. Alexander's sources worked fast. It didn't take long to uncover the mastermind behind the attacks on Isadora's company, one of Valentina's former associates, someone who saw Isadora as a threat, someone who wanted to block her rise. The moment Isadora found out, she didn't hesitate. She scheduled a meeting. Alexander didn't try to stop her. Instead, he stood beside her as she walked into that boardroom, head held high, eyes steady. The man sitting across from them, a seasoned businessman with too much arrogance and too little foresight, watched her with thinly veiled amusement. But the moment she spoke, that amusement faded. Did you think you'd scare me? She asked, her voice calm, steady. He said nothing. Let me be clear. She leaned forward slightly. I've lost everything before. But now, there is nothing that will make me back down. The man swallowed hard. He had lost before the conversation even started. After that confrontation, the attacks stopped. And Isadora had proven she was not an opponent to be taken lightly. But her victory had an unexpected consequence. For the first time, she realized something. Through everything, the threats, the battles, the rebuilding, Alexander had never left her side, not because he thought she was weak, not because he wanted to protect her from something she couldn't handle, but because he believed in her. And that made her question why, after all this time, she was still trying to keep her distance. One evening, Isadora sat in her office, lost in thought. The weight of everything pressed down on her, the past, the future, the choices she had yet to make. She didn't hear the door open until a small box landed on her desk with a soft thud. She looked up. Alexander stood there, his expression unreadable. It's been 3 months since you opened the company, he said casually, nodding toward the box. Curious, she picked it up and flipped open the lid. Inside was a silver keychain, a single letter engraved on it. I-H. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface, something warm spreading in her chest. To celebrate, he said. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she smiled. Genuine. Soft. Thank you. Alexander watched her for a beat before speaking. Will you ever stop running from me? Her breath hitched. His voice wasn't demanding. It wasn't expectant. It was just honest. Isadora, he continued, I'm not asking for anything. I just want to know if there's a chance. Her heart pounded. She knew the answer, but she couldn't say it. Not yet. Alexander saw the hesitation in her eyes. He nodded slightly, stepping back. It's okay, he said, his voice softer now. Like I said, I'm patient. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The moment the door closed behind him, Isadora exhaled sharply. She hadn't even realized she had been holding her breath. She was close to giving in. But when she finally made that decision, it wouldn't be something fleeting. It would be for good. And that scared her more than any threat she had ever faced. The next day, Isadora arrived at the office early, diving into reports and back-to-back meetings. Since the attacks on her company had ceased, she could finally focus on what truly mattered: growth. But as the morning stretched into the afternoon, something began to gnaw at her. Alexander hadn't shown up. That was unusual. Alexander always found a way to appear, whether with a fabricated work excuse or simply to tease her, disrupting her focus in that infuriatingly charming way of his. But today, no call, no messages. Nothing at first, she brushed it off, but as the hours passed, the unease inside her only grew. By the time the office clock hit 8 p.m., she couldn't take it anymore. Out of second thought, she grabbed her coat and left. Alexander's penthouse. She rang the doorbell. Twice. Several times. No answer. Her heartbeat spiked. Digging into her purse, she pulled out the spare key Alexander had given her for emergencies. She hesitated only for a second before unlocking the door and stepping inside. The penthouse was dimly lit, eerily silent, save for the low hum of the television in the background. Then, she saw him. Alexander, lying on the couch, barely covered by a thin blanket, his face unnervingly pale. His chest rose and fell with heavy, uneven breaths. "Alexander!" She rushed to his side, kneeling beside him. Her hand immediately went to his forehead, burning up. His eyelids fluttered open, hazy with fever. "Isadora!" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Her chest tightened. "Oh my God, you have a fever!" She cupped his face, her worry evident. He let out a weak breath. "It's just the flu." "I'm taking you to the hospital," she declared, already reaching for her phone. But before she could dial, his fingers wrapped around her wrist, stopping her. "No," he murmured. "I just need to rest." She shot him a glare. "Alexander, you're burning up." He tried to smirk, but it barely held. "If I go to the hospital, they'll take my blood. I hate needles." Isadora let out a frustrated sigh. "You're impossible." But her irritation was nothing compared to the gnawing concern tightening in her chest. She refused to leave him like this. Pushing to her feet, she made her way to the kitchen. Boiling water, tea. A damp cloth minutes later she returned, kneeling beside him again, gently placing the cool cloth on his forehead. "This will help bring down your fever." Alexander blinked up at her, his usually sharp eyes soft, unfocused. "You didn't have to come," he murmured. She should have deflected, should have said something dismissive. Instead, the truth slipped out. "Yes, I did." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Isadora didn't want to admit it. Didn't want to acknowledge the way seeing him like this, vulnerable, unwell, sent a sharp pang through her chest. But she didn't move, didn't leave. Instead, she stayed by his side, all night. She changed the cloth on his forehead, made sure he drank his tea, watched over him as his fever burned high and slowly began to drop. At some point, exhaustion took over. Isadora didn't even realize when she drifted off. Still sitting on the floor, her head resting against the edge of the couch, close enough to feel the faint, steady rhythm of his heartbeat. The next morning, Isadora stirred awake at the soft sensation of fingers threading gently through her hair. Her lashes fluttered open, and the first thing she saw was Alexander, his gaze warm, his touch impossibly soft. "Did you stay here all night?" he asked, his voice steadier, stronger than before. She blinked a few times, shaking off the remnants of sleep. "You were in bad shape." A small smirk tugged at his lips. "Someone had to take care of you?" He ran a hand over his face, inhaling deeply. "I feel much better. I think I had the best nurse in the world." Isadora let out a soft chuckle, standing up. "Well, that nurse is making breakfast." She moved into the kitchen, methodically preparing everything. fresh bread, neatly sliced fruit, orange juice, and strong coffee. She told herself she was just returning a favor, that the warmth curling in her chest was nothing but lingering concern. But as she carried the tray back into the living room, she found Alexander watching her. Not with amusement, not with teasing, with something else entirely. She frowned slightly, setting the tray down. "What?" He took a slow breath before finally speaking. "I love you, Isadora." The words froze her in place. For a second, she couldn't move, couldn't think. Alexander leaned forward, his voice steady. "Sure, I know you feel the same. I saw it last night, and the way you were worried about me." Her heart pounded. She wanted to argue, to deny, but this time there was no reason to, no excuses left. She exhaled softly. "I love you too, Alexander." The way his eyes lit up at her words, it was something she knew she would never forget. "Finally," he murmured before pulling her into a tight embrace. She laughed against his chest, warmth spreading through her like wildfire. "You're so persistent." He kissed the top of her head, his arms holding her firmly, and it was worth it. They pulled apart, and Isadora served breakfast, her movements calm, but her heart still racing. Alexander watched her every move, not just with admiration, but with the quiet intensity of someone memorizing every second. And then suddenly he said, "I want you to take the day off." She raised an eyebrow. "What?" He leaned back slightly, his smirk returning. "I want to take you somewhere special." She hesitated, only for a moment, because after everything, after last night, she didn't want to be away from him either. "All right," she crossed her arms. "Where are we going?" Alexander's smirk deepened. "It's a surprise." And just like that, something new began. Alexander drove down a quiet, winding road, the sound of crashing waves growing closer with every passing mile. When they arrived, Isadora stepped out of the car, and her breath caught in her throat. A secluded cabin nestled against the cliffs, overlooking an untouched private beach. The air smelled of salt and freedom. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, the sun dipping low, painting the sky in warm hues of amber and gold. She turned to him, stunned. "Alexander, this is beautiful," he smiled, watching her take it all in. "I knew you'd love it." The afternoon melted into something timeless. They walked along the shore, feeling the cool waves lap at their feet. They talked about everything and nothing, about the past, the future, and the things neither of them had ever admitted to anyone before. The sun began its slow descent, casting golden light over the water. Alexander found a large rock formation near the edge of the beach and sat down, gazing out at the horizon. Isadora joined him, brushing sand off her hands as her hair met her shoulder. "What is it?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally he spoke. "Before I met you, I was arrogant, ambitious. I only cared about power and myself." Isadora didn't interrupt. She simply listened. "But then you came along," he continued, his voice softer now, "and you started challenging me. At first I found it irritating." A small smirk flickered across her lips, but she said nothing. "But then I became intrigued." His gaze met hers, serious, unwavering. "You were the first person who wasn't afraid to stand up to me, and that made me realize something. I had surrounded myself with people who always said yes, who never questioned me, but you made me see the world differently." Her heart tightened. "Alexander, I never wanted to change you." His fingers brushed against hers. "But you did?" "You made me a better man." His voice was raw now, real, more human, more humble. A lump formed in her throat. She squeezed his hand gently. "And I fell in love with this version of you." Something flickered in his eyes, something deep, something permanent. He exhaled slowly, then took her hand fully, lacing his fingers with hers. "I need to ask you something." She frowned slightly. "What?" Alexander stood up, reaching into his pocket, and when he pulled out the small velvet box, her heart stopped. A perfect moment of anticipation. Isadora's eyes widened as Alexander pulled out a small velvet box. The moment he flipped it open, revealing a sparkling diamond ring, her heart stopped. The light from the setting sun danced across the gemstone, but it was his eyes. his unwavering expression that stole her breath away. "Isadora Deo," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I want to do this the right way. I want to love you the way you deserve, with respect, with patience, and with all my heart." A lump formed in her throat, and her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. Then his voice dropped to a whisper, full of hope, full of certainty. "Will you marry me?" She didn't have to think, didn't have to hesitate. Yes. The second the word left her lips, Alexander smiled, that rare, breathtaking smile, and slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he pulled her into a kiss. It was passionate, overwhelming, and filled with every unspoken promise they had ever made to each other. And at that moment, Isadora knew there were no more barriers between them. This was only the beginning of something even greater. As the sun set over the beach, hand in hand, Isadora and Alexander returned to the cabin. The air was warm, the scent of the ocean blending with the gentle breeze that made her hair dance. Alexander held her hand firmly, as if afraid she might slip away. But there were no more doubts. Not anymore. "I still can't believe we're engaged," Isadora murmured, glancing down at the ring that now adorned her finger. Alexander smirked, pulling her closer. "I knew this would happen. You just took your time accepting it." She rolled her eyes, laughing. "You never give up, do you?" "Never." His voice dropped slightly, turning serious. "Not when it comes to you." Her heart warmed at his words. She had never imagined finding a love this deep, this real. Later that night, the terrace of the cabin was bathed in the glow of candlelight. The scent of something delicious filled the air as Alexander plated their dinner, his movements expert and precise. Isadora folded her arms, watching him with amusement. "You're cooking," he teased, eyeing the perfectly plated dish in front of her. Alexander smirked, pouring red wine into their glasses. "I wanted to impress my fiancé." She picked up her glass, raising a toast. "To us, to our future." Alexander lifted his glass, his gaze locked on hers. "To the love of my life." Their glasses clinked softly against the sound of the waves, and in that perfect moment, everything felt exactly as it was meant to be. A beautiful transition into their next chapter. That night, they toasted, their glasses catching the glow of the candlelight, and enjoyed dinner wrapped in laughter and loving glances. It was effortless. It was them. And when the plates were cleared and the wine was nearly gone, Alexander reached for her hand. "Dance with me," he murmured. Isadora let out a soft laugh, but let him pull her to her feet. The ocean breeze brushed against them as he guided her under the stars, moving slowly, effortlessly. "Do you remember the first time we danced?" he asked, his voice low and filled with nostalgia. She smirked. "At that business event? I remember." Alexander chuckled. "You were with Nico. I was insanely jealous." She laughed softly, tilting her head up to meet his gaze. "You were, but now you know you never had to be." His grip on her tightened slightly as he whispered, "You were always meant to be mine." A warmth spread through her chest. She rested her head against his chest, feeling his steady heartbeat beneath her cheek. The Isadora realized one thing. He would never have to run from her feelings again. Months later. The big day finally arrived. For most of her life, Isadora never imagined herself dreaming of a wedding. But here she was, dressed in white, about to say "I do" to the man who had changed her life. The ceremony. The wedding was held in an enchanting seaside garden. Armed with elegant white chairs lined the aisle, adorned with delicate white roses. The ocean breeze carried the soft scent of flowers, while the rhythmic sound of waves created a backdrop nothing short of magical. At the altar, Alexander stood waiting. His sleek black suit fit him perfectly, his posture as strong and confident as ever. But when Isadora appeared at the end of the aisle, his breath hitched. Her hair fell in soft waves, framing her face beautifully. The delicate, flowing gown made her look ethereal. But what captivated him most wasn't the dress. It was her eyes, the way they sparkled, full of love, certainty, and something deeper than words. As she walked toward him, his heart pounded. and when she finally reached the altar, Alexander took her hands. He leaned in slightly, his voice meant just for her. "You look beautiful." A soft smile curved on her lips as her fingers squeezed his. Her eyes shone, not just with love but with tears threatening to spill. The officiant began the ceremony, speaking of love, partnership, and the meaning of building a life together. And when it was time for the vows, Alexander took a deep breath. He had never been more certain of anything in his life. What will he say? What will she say? This is the perfect lead-up to the most heartfelt moment of all, the vows. The garden was silent, save for the soft sound of waves in the distance. Isadora's heart pounded as Alexander took her hands, his grip firm, steady. And then he spoke. Isadora, from the moment I first saw you, you challenged me." Her breath hitched. "You never bowed down to me. You never blindly accepted my decisions. And that," his voice softened, "is what made me fall in love with you." Isadora's eyes filled with tears. "You taught me to be a better man. You made me see that power and money mean nothing if I don't have someone by my side to share life with." He squeezed her fingers, his voice filled with conviction. "I promise to love you, to respect you, and to make you happy every day of my life." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she was smiling. And then it was her turn. She took a slow breath before speaking, her voice thick with emotion. "Alexander, I spent my life fighting alone, believing I could never trust anyone." She saw the way his eyes darkened slightly, knowing exactly how true that was. "But you were persistent. You never gave up on me. And today, I know I never want to live without you." She barely finished before his thumb brushed against her hand, silent reassurance that she didn't have to fight alone anymore. The officiant smiled, voice warm and full of joy. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The moment the words left his lips, Alexander pulled her into a kiss, passionate, overwhelming. The sound of applause and cheers echoed around them, but neither of them heard it. In that moment there was only him, only her, only them. It was official. They were husband and wife. The honeymoon. It was perfect. They traveled to the most breathtaking destinations, hidden beaches, luxurious cities, places neither of them had ever seen before. They spent their days wrapped in sunshine, adventure, and laughter. And their nights were filled with whispers, soft touches, and a love that only deepened with every passing moment. And when they returned home, married life was even better than they had imagined. Alexander insisted on spoiling her, bringing her coffee in bed every morning, sneaking kisses whenever he could, showering her with small but thoughtful gestures. And Isadora, she returned the favor, preparing romantic dinners, leaving handwritten notes in his office, reminding him every day that he was her home. Their love only grew stronger. But then, something changed. It started subtly. Isadora felt off, tired, nauseous. At first, she brushed it off as exhaustion, but one morning, everything changed. She stood in the bathroom, staring at the pregnancy test in her trembling hands. Her heart raced. 2 lines. She was pregnant. Emotion overwhelmed her, and tears spilled down her cheeks. She and Alexander, they were going to have a baby. But when she went to the doctor to confirm it, the surprise was even bigger. She was expecting 1 baby. She was expecting twins. The perfect moment of anticipation. How will she tell Alexander? How will he react? When Isadora got home, her hands were trembling, her heart still racing from the doctor's words. He barely heard the door open. And then, Alexander was there. His sharp eyes immediately locked onto her, reading every unspoken emotion. "Isadora, what's wrong?" She looked up at him, her eyes shining with something unreadable. Her fingers clutched the small ultrasound printout tightly, then she finally said it. "Alexander, I'm pregnant." He froze. For the first time since she had known him, Alexander Lancaster was speechless. "What?" he breathed, as if needing to hear it again to believe it. A small smile broke across her lips. She reached for his hands, placing the ultrasound in his palm. "We're having twins." His eyes widened. Disbelief, joy, pure happiness flashing across his face in an instant. Then, suddenly, he laughed. A deep, genuine, full-bodied laugh, before wrapping her in a fierce, overwhelming hug. "Oh my God," he murmured against her hair, still laughing, still in awe. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his hands cradling her face. "We're having 2 babies," she nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks, happy tears. Alexander's smile was radiant, and then he kissed her deeply, fiercely, like this was the best moment of his life. When he pulled back, his voice was raw with emotion. "You just gave me the best news of my life." Isadora let out a teary laugh, overwhelmed by how right this felt. "I love you so much, Alexander." He leaned his forehead against hers, his thumb brushing her cheek. "And I love you more." The following months, an emotional roller coaster. Alexander became even more protective. He spoiled Isadora endlessly, making sure she ate well, resting his hand over her belly whenever he had the chance, constantly checking in. And at night, he would talk to the babies. He'd kneel beside her, whispering to her growing belly, "You two have no idea how much your mom and I love you already." And every single time, Isadora's heart melted. Here bedtime, he massaged her feet, insisting she shouldn't overdo it. And when she pushed back, telling him she was fine, "Fine isn't good enough, mi amor. You deserve to be treated like a queen." And honestly, she didn't mind being spoiled by him. The baby shower. The baby shower was beautiful. They were surrounded by family, friends, and so much love. And when the moment came to reveal the genders, the guests gasped as 2 balloons popped. One blue, one pink, a boy and a girl. Alexander wrapped his arms around Isadora, holding her close. His voice was soft but certain when he whispered, "We built an empire together, Isadora. Now we'll build a family." She smiled, tears of happiness welling in her eyes. "And it'll be the best one ever." And in that moment, Isadora knew. She had everything she had ever dreamed of: a home, true love, and now a growing family. And for the first time in her life, she would never be alone again. What did you think of Isadora and Alexander's story? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Rate this story from 0 to 10. How did it make you feel? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another unforgettable story. Looking for more heartwarming tales? Click on the screen now and let the next story inspire you. Let me know if you'd like any refinements.